Hey everyone, tonight we're going to talk about something that every human being who has ever lived has had to face. Something that connects you, sitting here in this moment, to a person who lived 40,000 years ago in a cave in southern France, or a rock shelter in southern Africa, or a river valley in what is now China. We're going to talk about loss, about what happens when someone you love dies, about grief, and how human beings have been dealing with it since before we had words for any of it. The evidence for what we're going to discuss tonight comes from archaeology, from physical anthropology, from the study of ancient burial sites and skeletal remains, from the analysis of pigments and grave goods and the arrangement of the dead, and from the careful study of what surviving hunter-gatherer communities around the world still practice today. This is not speculation. This is what science tells us. And what science tells us is extraordinary. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy what I do here. This is a small channel, and every subscriber truly matters. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There is a burial site in the ancient Levant called Qafzeh. It dates to approximately 100,000 years ago. In one of its graves, archaeologists found the skeleton of a child, perhaps 10 years old, carefully arranged in a sleeping position, with the legs slightly flexed and the arms positioned in a way that suggests the body was placed, not thrown, not abandoned, but placed with deliberate intention. Near the child's hands were the antlers of a fallow deer, apparently positioned so that the child could hold them. The antlers were not food. They were not tools. They served no practical purpose in a grave. They were placed there because someone who loved that child wanted to give them something to carry into whatever came next. This grave is 100,000 years old. That means that 100,000 years before the first city, 100,000 years before the first writing, 100,000 years before any of the structures we associate with civilization, a human being stood over the body of a child they loved and felt something so profound, so unbearable, so demanding of expression that they reached for the only language available to them, the language of ritual, of gesture, of the symbolic act. They placed the antlers in the child's hands, and then they covered the body with earth, and they walked away carrying something inside them that we would recognize immediately if we could somehow see it. Grief, the oldest human feeling. The study of prehistoric grief is a field that did not really exist until the late 20th century. For most of the history of archaeology, ancient burial sites were treated primarily as sources of information about material culture, what tools people used, what they ate, how they organized their societies. The emotional and psychological dimensions of what a burial represented were largely ignored, partly because they were considered unverifiable, and partly because there was a deep and persistent reluctance in academic circles to attribute complex emotional lives to people who had not yet developed the cultural markers that we associate with full humanity. That reluctance has been steadily dismantled over the past 3 decades by an accumulating body of evidence that is impossible to interpret any other way. Early humans grieved. They mourned their dead. They created rituals to mark the passage from life to death. And the complexity and care visible in the oldest known burials suggests that this behavior has roots that may go back much further than we once thought. Tonight we're going to follow the evidence through 11 chapters that take us from the earliest known signs of grief in the fossil record, through the first deliberate burials, through the care of the sick and dying, through the loss of children, through the death of companions and partners and elders, through the rituals that early humans created to manage the unmanageable, and through the ways in which the dead were kept alive in the memory and story of the community. By the end, we will have a picture of prehistoric emotional life that is considerably richer, considerably more moving, and considerably more recognizable than most people expect. Because the fundamental experience of losing someone you love has not changed in 100,000 years. The context is completely different. The biology is identical. Before we go further, it is worth spending some time on the question of evidence. How do we know what early humans felt? How can we make any claims about the emotional lives of people who left no written records, who cannot be interviewed, whose interior experience is in principle inaccessible to us? This is a legitimate methodological question, and it deserves a serious answer. The first line of evidence is neurological and evolutionary. Modern human beings have brains that are wired for attachment. The neuroscience of grief is now well understood. It involves the same neural circuits as physical pain. It activates the brain's reward system in patterns consistent with addiction and withdrawal, and it is deeply connected to the attachment system that evolved to bind mothers to infants and individuals to social groups. These neural systems did not appear in the last 10,000 years. They are ancient, shared in their basic architecture with other mammals, and particularly with other primates. The capacity for grief, the neurological machinery that makes the loss of an attachment figure painful, is a biological inheritance that our ancestors carried into the world long before they were anatomically modern humans. The second line of evidence is comparative. Every human culture ever studied, without exception, has practices for dealing with the dead. Burial, cremation, exposure, mummification, secondary burial. The specific practices vary enormously, but the underlying impulse, the need to do something deliberate and meaningful with the bodies of the dead, is universal. When a behavior appears in every human culture, across every time period and every geographic location, the most parsimonious explanation is that it reflects something deep and consistent in human biology and psychology. The universality of death ritual is one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have for the universality of grief. The third line of evidence is archaeological, and it is the most direct. The fossil record contains burials that are unmistakably deliberate. Bodies arranged in specific positions, bodies accompanied by objects that had no utilitarian value in a grave, bodies that show evidence of having been prepared, cleaned, pigmented, wrapped before interment. Graves that contain the remains of flowers, of animal parts, of ochre applied in patterns that suggest decoration or symbolism. Each of these features tells us something specific about what the people performing the burial were thinking and feeling. They were not simply disposing of a body, they were doing something for the dead person. And doing something for someone who can no longer benefit from your actions is, by definition, an act of love. The fourth line of evidence comes from cases of care for the sick and injured that went far beyond what simple survival logic would require. The fossil record contains numerous examples of individuals who survived injuries or conditions that would have been fatal without sustained help from others. A Neanderthal from Shanidar Cave in Iraq, known to researchers as Shanidar 1, had injuries so severe that he would have been unable to walk without support, unable to hunt, unable to gather food for himself, and almost certainly blind in one eye. He lived for years after these injuries. Someone fed him. Someone helped him move. Someone kept him alive at considerable cost to themselves and to the community. This is not the behavior of a species incapable of emotional attachment. This is love, expressed in the only language available, sustained, costly, selfless care. The oldest known deliberate burial of a modern human being dates to approximately 130,000 years ago. The site is Skull Cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel in what is now Palestine. The remains found there are those of at least 10 individuals, some of them buried with grave goods, including the jawbone of a wild boar held in the hands of one of the adult males. Whether this represents a ritual offering, a personal possession, a symbolic gift, or something whose meaning we cannot recover is uncertain. What is not uncertain is that these people were buried. They were not abandoned on the surface. They were not left as scavengers. Someone dug into the earth and placed these bodies in the ground with objects that mattered enough to include. Around the same age, perhaps slightly older, is the site of Qafzeh, which we mentioned in the opening. Qafzeh has produced some of the most moving burial evidence in the entire fossil record. In addition to the child buried with deer antlers, the site contains the grave of a woman buried alongside a child who may or may not have been hers. The two bodies arranged together, the child's legs across the woman's pelvis in a position that some researchers have interpreted as suggesting a mother and infant who died together, or close together, and were buried as a unit. Whether or not this interpretation is correct, the arrangement of the bodies at Qafzeh consistently shows a care and intentionality that speaks of people who did not simply want to dispose of the dead, but wanted to do something right by them. What motivated the first burials? This is a question that archaeologists have debated for decades, and the answers proposed fall into several broad categories. Practical motivations have been suggested. Burial removes decomposing bodies from living areas, reduces the risk of disease and predator attraction. But if practical sanitation were the primary motivation, you would expect to find bodies disposed of quickly and carelessly. What we find instead is bodies arranged deliberately, bodies accompanied by objects, bodies in positions that suggest they were placed rather than dropped. The care evident in early burials is inconsistent with a purely hygienic motivation. Spiritual or religious motivations have also been proposed: a belief in an afterlife, a desire to equip the dead for a journey, a need to ensure that the spirit of the dead person did not return to trouble the living. These interpretations are attractive and may contain truth, but they are difficult to verify from the archaeological evidence alone. What we can say is that the behavior of early burial is consistent with a belief that death is not simply an ending, that something persists after the body ceases to function, and that the living have obligations toward the dead that extend beyond the moment of death. Emotional motivations seem inescapable. The simplest explanation for why people buried their dead with care and with objects is that they loved them, that they could not bear to leave them on the surface, that placing them in the earth felt like doing something, felt like an act of protection even when protection was no longer possible. Grief is characterized in the psychological literature by a desperate need to do something, to act, to help, even when the person who needs help is gone. Burial satisfies that need. It gives the grieving person a task, a role, a way of continuing to care for someone they can no longer care for. This is probably the oldest function of the funeral, not to appease the gods, not to ensure safe passage, but simply to give love somewhere to go when the person it was directed toward is no longer there to receive it. Any serious discussion of prehistoric grief has to confront the Neanderthal question. Did Neanderthals, our closest evolutionary relatives, who shared the planet with anatomically modern humans for tens of thousands of years before disappearing around 40,000 years ago, did they grieve? Did they bury their dead? Did they have an emotional life complex enough to include mourning? This question has been debated with unusual intensity in paleoanthropology, partly because the answer has implications for how we think about what makes us human, and partly because the evidence is genuinely ambiguous in ways that have allowed researchers to interpret it in very different ways. The most famous Neanderthal burial site is Shanidar Cave in the Zagros Mountains of what is now northern Iraq. Excavated in the 1950s and 1960s by the archaeologist Ralph Solecki, the site produced the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals, some of them showing evidence of deliberate burial. The most extraordinary claim associated with Shanidar was the suggestion, made by Selecki based on pollen analysis of the soil around one of the burials, that the Neanderthal known as Shanidar IV had been buried on a bed of flowers. The image was powerful and immediately captured the popular imagination. The flower burial became one of the most widely cited pieces of evidence for Neanderthal emotional complexity, appearing in textbooks and documentaries and popular accounts of human evolution for decades. The flower burial hypothesis has since been substantially challenged. The pollen found in the soil may have been introduced by burrowing rodents who used the cave as a den and whose nests contained seeds and plant material. Subsequent excavations at Shanidar have not confirmed the flower burial interpretation with the clarity that would be needed to defend it confidently. But the debate over the flowers has somewhat overshadowed the more robust evidence from Shanidar, specifically the case of Shanidar I, the injured individual whose survival required sustained community care. Whatever we conclude about the flowers, the evidence that Neanderthals cared for their sick and injured in ways that went beyond immediate survival utility is strong. More recent evidence has been somewhat kinder to the idea of Neanderthal burial. A site in France called La Chapelle-aux-Saints, excavated in the early 20th century, contains the deliberately buried remains of an elderly Neanderthal male who had severe arthritis, had lost most of his teeth before death, and showed other signs of age-related deterioration that would have made independent survival impossible. He had been cared for, probably for years before his death. Whether his burial was deliberate has been debated, but more recent analysis of the site strongly suggests that a pit was dug to receive the body, that the burial was intentional rather than accidental. A 2023 study of another French site, La Ferracie, provided strong new evidence of deliberate Neanderthal burial in a case that is difficult to explain any other way. The Neanderthal evidence matters for our purposes, not because it proves that Neanderthals had exactly the same emotional lives as modern humans, but because it demonstrates that the behavior of caring for the dead has roots that go deeper than our own species. If Neanderthals were burying their dead, or at minimum were caring for their sick and injured in ways that reflect emotional attachment, then grief in some form is not an invention of Homo sapiens. It is an inheritance from a common ancestor. It is older than our species. It may be one of the deepest and most ancient features of the hominin lineage. In a world without hospitals, without professional medicine, without the elaborate infrastructure that modern societies have built around the process of dying, what happened when someone became seriously ill or injured? What did early humans do for a person who could no longer care for themselves? The evidence, both from the fossil record and from the study of contemporary hunter-gatherer communities, tells a story that is considerably more humane and more emotionally sophisticated than most people expect. The fossil record contains multiple examples of individuals who survive conditions that would have been fatal without sustained help. We have already mentioned Shanidar I, the Neanderthal whose injuries were so severe that he could not have survived without community support. But the pattern extends well beyond Neanderthals. Among anatomically modern humans, there are numerous skeletal remains showing healed injuries, healed infections, and evidence of long-term conditions that required ongoing care. A young adult from Romito in Italy, dating to around 17,000 years ago, had a severe form of acromesomelic dysplasia, a condition that would have caused progressive weakening and deformity of the arms and legs. This person lived well into early adulthood. They were not abandoned at the first sign of their condition, but were fed and cared for years by people who could have chosen not to. What does caring for a dying or severely ill person look like in a hunter-gatherer context? Ethnographic studies give us a fairly clear picture. The sick person is kept warm and sheltered, typically near the fire. They're given the most easily digestible foods available. Soft roots, cooked in broth, pre-processed so that minimal chewing is required. Someone stays with them during the night. Someone monitors their breathing, their temperature, their responses. The band's most knowledgeable members, typically elderly women with the deepest botanical knowledge, apply whatever medicinal plants are available and understood to help. The medicine available to early humans was not negligible. Archaeological evidence for the use of medicinal plants goes back at least 60,000 years. Ochre, which has antimicrobial properties, appears to have been applied to wounds. Plants with analgesic properties were known and used. The evidence from ancient dental calculus, the calcified plaque preserved on the teeth of ancient individuals, has revealed the presence of specific plant compounds that are known to have medicinal properties, suggesting deliberate use rather than incidental consumption. Early humans were not practicing modern medicine, but they were practicing medicine with the knowledge and tools available to them, and they were applying it to people who needed it. The emotional dimension of caring for the dying is captured in the ethnographic literature in ways that are both moving and recognizable. Studies of hunter-gatherer responses to serious illness consistently describe a pattern of collective mobilization. The whole band becomes involved. Hunting and gathering continue, but food is brought back and shared preferentially with the sick person and with those who are caring for them. Conversation around the evening fire shifts. There is more quiet, more gentleness, more attention to the person who is ill. Children are kept somewhat closer, somewhat quieter. The atmosphere of the camp changes in a way that everyone in it can feel. This is community grief in its anticipatory form. Not yet mourning, but already oriented toward the loss that is coming. The moment of death in a hunter-gatherer context is rarely faced alone. The small size of the band and the intimacy of the living arrangements mean that death happens in company. The dying person is surrounded by people who know them, who love them, who have shared food and fire and stories with them for years. What is said in those final hours, what is held and touched and remembered, we cannot know. But we know that it happened in the presence of others, and that the others stayed. The fossil record shows us the aftermath, the care taken with the body, the deliberateness of the burial, the objects placed in the grave. The hours before death are invisible to us, but we can infer from what comes after that they were not empty. Of all the losses that early humans faced, the loss of children was the most common and arguably the most devastating. In a world without modern medicine, without vaccines, without antibiotics, without the ability to manage the complications of childbirth or the fevers of childhood illness, child mortality was extraordinarily high. Estimates based on the skeletal evidence from prehistoric populations suggest that somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before the age of 5. In some populations and some time periods, the figure was higher. For parents in the Paleolithic world, the loss of a child was not a rare and terrible exception to the normal course of life. It was something that almost every parent experienced, often more than once. The archaeological evidence for parental grief over dead children is among the most emotionally affecting material in the entire fossil record. Infant burials from the Upper Paleolithic onward frequently show evidence of particular care, more care in many cases than the burials of adults in the same communities. Infants are buried with ornaments, with pigment, with objects that must have been specifically selected for them. At the site of Sungir in Russia, dating to around 30,000 years ago, 2 children were buried together in a single grave, a boy of about 12 and a girl of about 9 or 10, with an extraordinary assemblage of grave goods. They were covered in thousands of mammoth ivory beads that had been sewn onto their clothing, along with ivory pins, carved animal figurines, and 2 straightened mammoth tusks, each over 2 meters long, that flank their bodies. The Sungir children's burial is one of the most lavishly furnished graves of the entire Paleolithic period. More elaborately equipped, in terms of the quantity and quality of the grave goods, than any of the adult burials at the same site. This asymmetry is striking and has been noted by many researchers. Why would children receive more elaborate burial treatment than adults? Several explanations have been proposed. Some researchers suggest that the elaborate burials reflect the children's social status, that they were the children of high-status individuals whose position required a particularly visible display of wealth and grief. Others have proposed that the elaborateness of child burials reflects a belief that children who died young needed extra provision for their journey into the afterlife, that they were less prepared for death and required more help. But the simplest explanation is also the most human one. The people who buried those children at Sungir were devastated. They had more to give than they knew what to do with. They gave it to the graves. The cross-cultural evidence for intense parental grief over child loss is overwhelming. In every human society ever studied, the death of a child is experienced as one of the most severe forms of loss. Grief researchers classify it as a bereavement of particular intensity and duration, one that disrupts the normal trajectory of mourning in ways that other losses do not. This is not culturally constructed, it is biological. The attachment between parent and infant is one of the deepest neural bonds the human brain forms, shaped by millions of years of evolution, because it is essential to the survival of a species whose offspring are dependent for longer than those of almost any other animal on Earth. When that bond is severed, the neurological response is proportional to its depth. What did early parents do with this grief? The burials give us part of the answer, but ethnographic evidence adds texture. Among contemporary hunter-gatherer communities, the death of a child is followed by a period of intense communal mourning. Work stops or slows significantly. The whole band participates in the rituals of burial and commemoration. The parents are not expected to function normally for an extended period. They are supported, fed, and accompanied. Their grief is not treated as a private matter to be managed individually. It is a community event, a shared loss, because in a band of 25 people, every child belongs in some sense to everyone. The mothers in these communities, according to the ethnographic accounts, carry the memory of their lost children in specific and deliberate ways. The name of the dead child may be spoken or may be avoided depending on the culture's beliefs about the dead. But the child is remembered, actively and consciously, sometimes for years, sometimes for the rest of the mother's life. This is not pathological. It is the human response to the severing of the deepest possible attachment. And it is as old as parenthood itself. If the loss of a child was the most common form of grief in the Paleolithic world, the loss of a companion, a partner, a closest friend, the person who walked beside you on every hunt and every long journey, was arguably the most disorienting. In a band of 25 people, relationships were not interchangeable. Each person occupied a specific role, carried specific knowledge, filled a specific emotional niche in the lives of the people around them. When someone died, they took with them not just their own life, but the particular version of life that existed when they were in it. The world that remained was, in a quite literal sense, a different world from the one that had existed before. The anthropological literature on grief in small-scale societies consistently documents a particular quality of loss that is associated with the death of long-term companions and partners, a disorientation that goes beyond sadness into something more fundamental. The routines of daily life, which in a hunter-gatherer context are deeply embedded in specific relationships, suddenly have no one to perform them with. The hunt was always conducted with the same partner, the fire that was always tended by the same hands, the stories that were always told by the same voice. In a modern context, grief researchers describe this as the loss of the assumptive world, the disruption of the background assumptions about how life works, that we build unconsciously over years of living with another person. In a Paleolithic context, where every aspect of daily life was conducted in close physical proximity to a small number of known individuals, this disruption would have been total and immediate. The fossil evidence for grief between adult companions is harder to document directly than the evidence from burials, but it is not absent. There are cases of individuals buried in pairs or in close physical association, adult graves that appear to represent people who were interred together deliberately, whose bodies were arranged in relation to each other in ways that suggest they were understood as belonging together, even in death. Whether these represent partners, siblings, or other close relationships, we cannot always determine, but the impulse to keep certain people together, to refuse to separate them even in burial, speaks to a conception of relationship that does not end at death. The practical consequences of losing a companion in the Paleolithic world were also significant in ways that had no modern equivalent. In a band where each person was a specialist, where decades of accumulated knowledge and skill were stored in a single human mind, the death of a companion meant the loss of irreplaceable expertise. The hunter knew the routes through the mountain pass, the gatherer who knew which routes to dig after a long, dry season, the toolmaker who knew the technique for working the particularly difficult local flint. When these people died, their knowledge died with them unless it had been passed on. The grief for a lost companion was therefore entangled with a practical anxiety that had no modern equivalent, the recognition that something essential to the community's survival had been lost along with the person. This is one of the reasons why the role of the elder was so critical in early human communities, and why the death of an elder was treated with particular significance. The elders were the community's library. They were the people who remembered the bad winter 40 years ago and knew what had gotten the band through it. They were the people who had seen the river flood 3 times and knew which high ground was safe. They were the people who knew which medicinal plant grew in the valley 2 days' walk to the north and how to prepare it. When an elder died, a volume of that library was lost forever. The grief for an elder in a hunter-gatherer community was therefore not only emotional but existential, a recognition that the community had become, in a measurable sense, less capable of surviving. Human beings are ritual-creating animals. In the face of experiences that cannot be controlled, cannot be understood, and cannot be reversed, and death is the supreme example of all three, human beings create rituals. Not because rituals change the outcome. The dead do not return because of what is done at their graves, but because rituals give structure to the unstructurable, because they provide a script for a situation that is otherwise without guidance, because they channel the energy of grief into action, and in doing so make the unbearable marginally more bearable. The earliest evidence of death rituals in the fossil record is also some of the most compelling evidence we have for the emotional complexity of prehistoric human beings. Ochre is perhaps the oldest ritualized substance in the human story. The red iron oxide pigment appears at archaeological sites associated with human activity, going back 300,000 years or more. It is found in enormous quantities at sites like Blombus Cave in South Africa, where it was being ground, mixed, and apparently stored in abalone shells at least 75,000 years ago. It appears consistently in burial contexts across multiple continents and multiple time periods, sprinkled over bodies, applied to bones, mixed into the fill of graves. Its specific meaning in any given context is something we cannot recover, but its consistent association with death ritual suggests that it carried symbolic weight that was specifically connected to the transition from life to death. Why ochre? Several hypotheses have been proposed. Ochre is red, and red is the color of blood, of life, of vitality, of the force that flows through living bodies and stops when they die. Applying ochre to a dead body may have been a way of symbolically restoring the vitality that had departed of giving back in pigment what death had taken in reality. Ochre also has mild antimicrobial properties, which may have been noticed and valued in a practical sense. But the quantities in which ochre appears in burial contexts, sometimes enormous quantities, far more than any practical application would require, suggest that its significance was primarily symbolic rather than functional. Grave goods, the objects placed with the dead, are another form of ritual that appears consistently across the archaeological record of prehistoric death. We have already mentioned the deer antlers placed in the child's hands at Qafzeh, the boar's jawbone at school, the extraordinary assemblage at Sungir. Across the Upper Paleolithic, we find burials accompanied by tools, by ornaments, by animal parts, by food remains, by musical instruments, by objects that appear to have been specifically made for the burial rather than taken from the deceased's everyday possessions. What does it mean to give something to the dead? It means that you believe on some level that they will need it, that wherever they're going, they should not go empty-handed. This is a belief that implies something about the nature of death, that it is not an ending but a continuation, that the dead person persists in some form that can use tools and wear ornaments and eat food. Body position is another element of burial ritual that carries meaning. Early human burials show a remarkable consistency in the preference for placing bodies in what researchers call the flexed position. Knees drawn up toward the chest, arms folded, the body curled in an attitude that resembles sleep, or that resembles the position of a fetus in the womb. Whether this represents a belief in rebirth, a desire to return the dead to the earth in the same posture they occupied before birth, a practical accommodation to the size of the grave, or simply a universal human instinct to make a sleeping person comfortable, is impossible to determine with certainty. But the consistency of the practice across widely separated cultures and time periods suggests that it reflects something deep and consistent in how human beings conceptualize death. The role of music in prehistoric death rituals deserves particular attention. The oldest known musical instruments, bone flutes from the caves of the Swabian Jura in Germany, date to approximately 40,000 years ago. Music appears to be a human universal, present in every culture ever studied, and its role in ritual contexts, particularly death ritual, is documented across virtually all human societies. Music does something to grief that nothing else does. It creates a container for emotion that is simultaneously personal and communal. Everyone present shares the same sound at the same moment, and the sound itself carries an emotional charge that bypasses rational processing and speaks directly to the parts of the brain that process attachment and loss. Whether early humans sang at their burials, whether they played their bone flutes while they mourned, whether they drummed or danced or keened, we cannot know for certain. But the probability that they did something musical in the face of death is very high. Music and death have been companions in human culture for as long as we have evidence of either. One of the most consistent features of human grief across cultures and across time is the refusal to accept that death means the complete disappearance of the person who has died. In virtually every human culture ever studied, the dead persist in some form beyond their biological death, as ancestors, as spirits, as presences in the landscape, as participants in the ongoing life of the community even after their physical absence. The specific forms this persistence takes vary enormously, but the underlying impulse, to keep the dead alive, to maintain a relationship with them, to continue talking to them and thinking about them and including them in the community's sense of itself, appears to be universal. In the archaeological record, this impulse shows up in several distinctive ways. Secondary burial, the practice of initially burying a body, and then, after some interval during which the soft tissue decomposes, disinterring the bones and reburying them, or doing something deliberate with them, appears at multiple prehistoric sites, and suggests an ongoing relationship with the dead that does not end with the initial interment. The bones of ancestors were kept, handled, sometimes painted with ochre, sometimes passed between generations, sometimes incorporated into living spaces. In some archaeological contexts, ancestral skulls appear to have been curated as objects of ongoing significance, kept near the living, treated with care, perhaps addressed as interlocutors in the way that many cultures address their ancestors. In living hunter-gatherer communities, the dead are kept alive primarily through story. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, the dead are remembered in specific stories that describe their particular characteristics. Not generic eulogies, but specific narratives about what made this person themselves. The elder who knew where the water was in the dry season. The hunter who once tracked a wounded buffalo for 3 days and returned with it. The woman who could identify 40 types of edible root by their above-ground stems. These stories circulate for years after the person's death, keeping them present in the community's collective memory in a form that carries genuine information. The stories of the dead are not purely commemorative, they are also instructional. They teach the living what to do by example, extending the influence of the dead person's knowledge and judgment beyond their biological life. This is one of the most profound things that early humans did with death. They made the dead useful, not in a cynical or disrespectful sense, but in the deepest and most meaningful sense. They took the accumulated wisdom of the people who had died and wove it into the ongoing life of the community through story. The elder who died, knowing where the river crossing was safe in flood season, did not take that knowledge with them entirely. If the story was told often enough, vividly enough, compellingly enough, the knowledge persisted. The oral tradition was not just entertainment, it was the community's immune system against the loss of essential knowledge. Every story told about the dead was an act of preservation. Every name spoken was a refusal to let a person disappear entirely. Human beings are not the only animals that grieve. This is one of the most significant findings of the last 3 decades of animal behavior research, and it has important implications for how we think about the origins of grief in our own species. The evidence for grief-like behavior in non-human animals, particularly in the great apes, in elephants, in cetaceans such as dolphins and whales, and in several species of corvids, including ravens and crows, suggest that the neural foundations of grief are considerably older than our species and possibly older than our entire genus. The behavior of chimpanzees toward their dead has been documented in multiple field studies. Jane Goodall recorded the case of a young chimpanzee named Flint, who became severely depressed after the death of his mother Flo, stopped eating, withdrew from social contact, and died himself within weeks. A case that she and subsequent researchers have interpreted as grief, or at minimum as a profound disruption of the attachment system with fatal consequences. Other researchers have documented chimpanzees sitting with and apparently guarding the bodies of dead infants for days or weeks after death, sometimes carrying the body with them as they travel, sometimes returning to the location where a group member died long after the body is decomposed. These behaviors are not uniform and not universal in chimpanzees, but they're documented consistently enough to represent a real pattern. Elephants display some of the most elaborate grief-like behaviors of any non-human animal. Wild elephants have been observed returning repeatedly to the bones of dead companions, touching and manipulating the bones with their trunks, sometimes moving individual bones, sometimes covering the body with vegetation. When a matriarch dies, the rest of the herd may spend days in the vicinity of the body in a state of apparent agitation and distress. Calves whose mothers have died sometimes stand beside the body for days, refusing to leave. The elephant response to death has been described by researchers including Joyce Poole and Cynthia Moss as bearing more resemblance to human mourning behavior than the behavior of any other non-human species. For early humans, living in intimate contact with the natural world, the grief of animals would not have been invisible. Hunter-gatherers are acute observers of animal behaviour. Their survival depends on it, and the emotional responses of the animals they hunted and lived alongside would have been noticed, interpreted, and incorporated into their understanding of death. The mother elephant standing over her dead calf, the chimpanzee sitting beside a dead companion. The crow returned to the place where a flock member was killed. These behaviours would have been observed and understood, probably not in the analytical terms of modern animal behaviour research, but in the intuitive, experiential way that people who spend their lives watching animals understand what animals do. The universality of grief across species may have been one of the earliest clues that death means the same thing to everyone who experiences loss, that the response to losing someone you're attached to is not a cultural construction, but a biological reality that runs through life itself. We are near the end of tonight's journey, and it is worth pausing to consider what the evidence we've been discussing actually means, not just as archaeology, not just as evolutionary biology, but as a human story. Because that is what it is, a human story. One of the oldest and most continuous and most universal human stories there is. Grief has sometimes been described in the psychological literature as the price of love. It is what love costs when the person it is directed toward is no longer there to receive it. This formulation is useful because it reminds us that grief and love are not separate experiences but two aspects of the same thing. You cannot have one without the capacity for the other. The depth of grief is proportional to the depth of attachment, and the capacity for deep attachment, for love that persists through absence and loss, that maintains its connection to a person who is no longer physically present, is one of the defining features of our species. The evidence from the fossil record, from Qafzeh to Sungir to Shanidar, tells us that this capacity is ancient. It was not invented by civilization. It was not created by religion, though religion has been one of the primary ways that human societies have tried to manage it. It was not the product of writing or of philosophy, or of any of the cultural innovations that we associate with the emergence of complex human societies. It was there from the beginning. The first deliberate burial, the first object placed in the earth beside a body that could no longer use it. The first time someone stood at a grave and felt the weight of an absence that would not lift. These things happened before agriculture, before pottery, before any of the markers we use to define civilization. They happened because human beings are capable of love. And love, when it loses its object, becomes grief. And grief, because it is unbearable to simply hold, becomes ritual. And ritual, because it needs to be repeated and transmitted, becomes culture. This is the chain of causation that runs from the oldest burial we know about to every funeral that has been held since then. From the antlers in the child's hands at Qafzeh 100,000 years ago, to the flowers on the graves of today. From the ochre sprinkled over the dead in a cave in South Africa, to the last rites performed in every tradition that has ever existed. The specific forms change. The impulse does not. The need to do something for the person who has died, to honour them, to keep them present, to refuse to let them disappear entirely into the silence. That need is as old as our capacity for attachment, as old as love itself. When you grieve, you are participating in the oldest human tradition there is, older than agriculture, older than language as we know it, perhaps, certainly older than any religious tradition, any philosophical system, any cultural institution. The grief you feel when you lose someone is not a malfunction. It is not a weakness. It is not something to be managed into silence as quickly as possible. It is the biological signature of a capacity for love that is the most distinctively human thing about us. The people who buried the child at Qafzeh with deer antlers in their hands would understand what you feel when you lose someone without a single word being exchanged. Because the feeling is the same. because it has always been the same, because it is what we are. The archaeological record of prehistoric death is not a record of primitive people struggling with a concept they did not fully understand. It is a record of fully modern human beings doing what fully modern human beings do in the face of the hardest thing that life asks of them. They loved it. They lost. They mourned. They created rituals to make the mourning bearable. They told stories to keep the dead alive. They cared for each other in the carrying of their grief. And then, because life required it, they went on. They got up in the morning. They tended the fire. They went out into the world to find food for the people who remained. They carried their losses with them as they walked, the way human beings have always carried their losses, as a weight that does not disappear but that becomes, over time, part of the weight of being alive. This has been Midnight Chronicle. Sleep well, wherever in the world you are tonight. There is something worth sitting with before we move into the evidence. The fact that we are having this conversation at all, that it is possible to reconstruct the emotional lives of people who lived 100,000 years ago, is itself a remarkable achievement of modern science. For most of human history, the prehistoric past was a blank. We knew that people had lived before recorded history because we found their tools and their bones. But the inner lives of those people, their feelings and their relationships and their responses to the great crises of existence, were considered permanently inaccessible. The science of the last few decades has changed that. Not completely, not without significant remaining uncertainty, but meaningfully. We can now make defensible, evidence-based claims about what prehistoric people felt, and the picture that emerges is one of emotional lives as rich, as complex, and as recognizably human as our own. The emotional capacity of early humans is not a matter of philosophical speculation. It is, increasingly, a matter of neuroscience. The human brain is not a recent invention. The limbic system, the network of structures that generates and regulates emotion, is among the most evolutionarily ancient parts of the human brain, shared in its basic architecture with other mammals and in its deeper structures with all vertebrates. The specific emotional experiences that human beings have, the particular quality of grief, of love, of fear, of joy, are shaped by the neocortex and by the specific social environments of human life. But the underlying capacity for those experiences is rooted in neural structures that predate our species by tens of millions of years. Early humans did not need to evolve the capacity for emotion. They inherited it. What they did with it, how they expressed it, how they structured their communities to manage it. That is the story we are telling tonight. The question of when grief became specifically human, when it took on the particular character that we recognize as distinctly human mourning, rather than simply the distress response that many animals show when an attachment figure disappears, is one that cannot be answered with a precise date. But there are moments in the fossil record that serve as landmarks. The deliberate burials are one. The care of the injured and ill is another. The production of objects whose only apparent purpose is commemorative or symbolic is a third. Together, these landmarks trace the emergence of a relationship to death that is not just emotional, but reflective, that does not just respond to loss but thinks about it, creates rituals to manage it, and builds cultural systems to carry the memory of the dead forward through time. The geography of early burial is itself revealing. At multiple Upper Paleolithic sites, the dead were buried within or very close to the living area of the community, inside caves, under the floors of rock shelters, in the immediate vicinity of the hearth. This is so different from modern practice, which tends to separate the living from the dead with considerable physical distance, that it requires explanation. One possibility is purely practical. In a world where predators were a constant threat, leaving a body on the surface was not an option. and burying it nearby was the simplest solution. But the care evident in these burials suggests that proximity to the dead was not merely convenient, it was chosen. The dead were kept close. They were not expelled to a separate domain, but maintained as presences in the space where life continued. This proximity may reflect a fundamentally different conception of death from the one that most modern Western cultures have inherited. In many traditional societies, the dead are not understood to be gone in any absolute sense. They remain in the world, transformed but present, sometimes as protective ancestors, sometimes as potentially dangerous spirits who need to be managed, sometimes as interlocutors who can be addressed and consulted. The specific beliefs vary enormously, but the underlying conception that death does not remove a person from the community but changes their relationship to it appears consistently enough across cultures to suggest that it may be the default human response to loss in the absence of the specific cultural training that tells us otherwise. The transition from keeping the dead nearby to placing them at a distance, from burial inside the living space to burial at a designated distance from it, appears to have been gradual and culturally variable. Some archaeological sites show evidence of this transition playing out over generations, with earlier burials inside the shelter and later burials outside it. Whether this transition reflects changing beliefs about the nature of death and the dead, changing practical circumstances, or simply the accumulation of bodies in limited space is not always clear. But the trajectory, from keeping the dead close to placing them at a respectful distance, may represent the earlier stages of the development of the cemetery, the dedicated space for the dead that appears in more elaborate forms in later archaeological periods. The debate over Neanderthal burial has been particularly heated because the stakes are high. If Neanderthals buried their dead, if they had death rituals comparable in complexity to those of early modern humans, then the capacity for grief and for the rituals of mourning is not uniquely human in the modern sense, but represents a deeper inheritance from our shared evolutionary history with the Neanderthals. This would mean that the emotional and cultural dimensions of our response to death are not recent innovations but ancient features of the hominin lineage, present in our cousins as well as in ourselves. The implications for how we understand the uniqueness of modern human cognition are significant. The most recent contribution to the Neanderthal burial debate comes from a study published in 2023 by a team led by archaeologist William Rendu, which analysed skeletal remains and geological context from the site of La Ferracie in France. The team concluded that the Neanderthal remains at La Ferracie were intentionally buried in pits that were dug specifically to receive them, that the burials were deliberate and recent relative to the age of the surrounding sediment. This is not the final word on the subject, but it adds significantly to the accumulating body of evidence that Neanderthal burial was real. The argument that Neanderthal burials were accidental, or that apparent burial contexts were the result of natural processes, has become increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of multiple lines of evidence from multiple sites. What is equally significant about the Neanderthal evidence is the care for the living that it documents. Shanidar 1, the elderly Neanderthal male with the catastrophic injuries, is not the only case of its kind. Multiple Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of surviving injuries or conditions that would have been fatal without sustained help. An individual from Saint-Césaire in France had a severe head wound that healed after what must have been weeks of care. An individual from Gibraltar showed evidence of having lost multiple teeth before death and having survived on a diet that required the food to be pre-processed, suggesting that someone was preparing soft food specifically for this individual over an extended period. The pattern across multiple sites and multiple individuals is too consistent to be coincidental. Neanderthals took care of their injured and their ill, and taking care of someone who cannot care for themselves is an act of love. The role of the community in supporting those who cared for the dying deserves emphasis. In a hunter-gatherer band, care for the dying is never truly an individual burden. When someone is seriously ill, the whole community adjusts. The division of labour shifts to ensure that the caregiver does not have to also hunt or gather. Food is brought to them. Children in the community are managed by others so that the caregiver can focus their attention. This redistribution of burden is not formal or institutionalized. There is no protocol, no designated carer, no official support structure. It happens organically, driven by the social bonds that connect everyone in the band and by the shared understanding that what happens to one member of the group affects all of them. The anthropologist Kim Hill, who has spent decades studying the ache hunter-gatherers of Paraguay, has documented the extraordinary generosity with which contemporary hunter-gatherer communities support their sick and dying members. The ache, he found, essentially never abandons injured or sick members unless the situation is genuinely catastrophic. A forced march under attack, a situation where moving would kill the healthy as well as the sick. Under normal circumstances, the community adapts to the needs of its most vulnerable members, with a flexibility and a generosity that Hill found consistently striking. This behaviour is not unique to the ache. It appears in the ethnographic literature for hunter-gatherer communities across multiple continents, suggesting that it reflects something deep in the social architecture of small-scale human communities. The psychological literature on anticipatory grief, the grief that begins before a death, when a loved one is visibly declining, is relevant here. Modern research on anticipatory grief documents that the process of watching someone die slowly is among the most psychologically demanding experiences a human being can have, combining the stress of caregiving with the emotional weight of a loss that is coming but has not yet arrived. For early humans caring for a dying companion, the anticipatory grief would have been compounded by the absence of any medical framework within which to understand what was happening, and by the absence of any cultural script for death, other than the scripts their community had developed through its own experience. Each death was, in some sense, encountered fresh. Each dying had to be faced with only the resources of the community's own wisdom and the accumulated experience of whatever deaths had been witnessed before. The infant mortality of the Paleolithic world created a pattern of child loss that modern parents in wealthy countries have no experiential framework for understanding. In the developed world today, the loss of a child is a devastating exception to what is otherwise an almost universal expectation that children will survive to adulthood. For a Paleolithic parent, the survival of a child to adulthood was not an expectation, but a hope, and a hope that was frequently frustrated. The experience of repeated child loss, of burying not one child but 2, 3, 4, was not unusual. It was the normal course of parental life for hundreds of thousands of years. How does repeated loss shape the psychology of grief? Modern bereavement research offers some insight. Contrary to what might be intuitively expected, the experience of multiple losses does not necessarily reduce the emotional impact of each subsequent loss. Grief does not become easier through repetition in any simple way. What does happen is that the grieving person develops a more complex relationship to loss, a kind of lived wisdom about how grief works, what it demands, and how to carry it while continuing to function. Among contemporary communities with high child mortality, researchers have documented exactly this kind of wisdom, a recognition that child loss is part of life, a cultural framework that supports mourning without prolonging it into dysfunction, and a remarkable capacity to love the next child fully even after the loss of previous ones. The question of whether early humans protected themselves from the pain of child loss by forming less intense attachments to infants is one that has been raised in the anthropological literature and that the evidence consistently fails to support. The evolutionary logic of strong parent-infant attachment operates regardless of mortality rates. Indeed, in high mortality environments, the motivation to care intensively for each individual infant is, if anything, stronger, not weaker. And the archaeological evidence from child burials, the care, the grave goods, the ochre, the deliberate placement, speaks of attachment so intense that it demanded expression even in death. Early human parents loved their children as fiercely as parents love their children today. The difference is that they lost them more often, and they carried those losses forward, as people always have, in memory and in story, and in the continuing force of love for the children who remained. The social architecture of the hunter-gatherer band was designed in ways that were probably never consciously planned, but that emerged from the needs and dynamics of small group living to distribute the impact of loss. When someone died in a band of 25 people, every surviving member of that band was affected, not just emotionally but practically. The relationships that had connected the dead person to every other member of the band did not simply disappear at death. They left gaps, disruptions, adjustments that needed to be made across the entire social fabric of the community. The person who had hunted with Kale for 20 years was gone, and Kale now had to hunt with someone else, and had to learn a new hunting partner's signals and rhythms and strengths. The person who had gathered with Sire every morning was gone, and Sire now walked different routes, or walked familiar routes alone. These practical adjustments were themselves a form of grief, the daily renegotiation of a world that no longer contained the person who'd been so central to it. The concept of the assumptive world is central to modern grief psychology. Judith Herman Bowlby, and more recently Colin Parkes, have all written about the way that grief shatters the assumptions on which daily life is built. The assumption that the world is basically safe and predictable. The assumption that the people we depend on will continue to be there. The assumption that the future will bear some resemblance to the past. The shattering of these assumptions is one of the most painful aspects of grief, because it does not just produce sadness, it produces a kind of disorientation, a sense that the world itself has become unfamiliar. For early humans whose entire world was contained within the band and the territory it occupied, the death of a central member of that band would have produced an acute version of this disorientation. The world they had known, the specific configuration of relationships and roles and daily routines that had defined their reality, no longer existed. What remained was a different world, and they had to learn to inhabit it. The mechanisms that hunter-gatherer communities use to support members through this disorientation are documented in the ethnographic literature with considerable consistency. The most important is simply presence, being physically with the bereaved person, staying close, not leaving them alone in the immediate aftermath of loss. The second is work, giving the grieving person tasks that are manageable and productive, that reconnect them to the practical rhythms of daily life without demanding more than they can give. The third is story, talking about the dead person, telling stories about them, keeping them present in the community's conversation, so that the bereaved person does not have to mourn alone, but does so in the company of others who also knew and loved the person who is gone. These not sophisticated therapeutic interventions, they're common sense practiced by people who understood, through long experience, what grief requires. The development of ritual as a response to death represents one of the most significant cognitive achievements of the human lineage. Ritual is not simply repetitive behavior, it is behavior that has been assigned meaning. Behavior that is performed not because of its direct practical consequences, but because of what it represents, what it enacts, what it communicates. The capacity for ritual requires the capacity for symbolic thought, the ability to understand that an action stands for something beyond itself, that the pouring of water on a grave is not simply the wetting of earth, but the enactment of a belief or a hope or a grief. This capacity is one of the defining features of modern human cognition. The earliest evidence for symbolic behavior in the fossil record predates the earliest evidence for burial by tens of thousands of years. Other uses, personal ornaments, geometric engravings, all of these appear in the archaeological record before the oldest deliberately buried bodies. This suggests that the cognitive infrastructure for ritual, the capacity for symbolic thought that ritual requires, was already in place when the first funerary rituals were performed. Early humans did not invent symbolic thought in order to bury their dead. They brought an existing capacity for symbolic expression to the task of dealing with death, and in doing so created some of the most elaborate and emotionally significant symbolic behavior in the archaeological record. The function of ritual in managing grief has been studied extensively by both anthropologists and psychologists, and the findings are consistent. Ritual reduces anxiety in the face of uncontrollable events. It creates a sense of agency, of doing something, in situations where nothing can actually be done to change the outcome. It provides a social script that tells everyone present what to do and how to behave, reducing the cognitive load of navigating an emotionally overwhelming situation. And it creates a shared experience that connects the participants to each other and to a larger community of meaning. Connecting this particular death to all the deaths that have come before and to all the deaths that will come after, placing individual loss in a context that makes it, if not bearable, at least not utterly isolated. The oral tradition through which early humans kept the dead alive was not a primitive or unsophisticated form of cultural transmission. It was extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily demanding. The transmission of knowledge through story without the aid of writing requires a kind of memory and a kind of narrative skill that most modern people do not develop, because writing has made those skills unnecessary. In cultures that depend on oral tradition, memory is trained from childhood in ways that allow individuals to store and retrieve vast amounts of information in accurate and usable form. The techniques used, mnemonic devices, rhythmic patterns, repetition, embedding of information in narrative, are sophisticated memory technologies that have been refined over thousands of years. The content of oral tradition in hunter-gatherer societies is not trivial. Studies of the oral knowledge systems of indigenous communities around the world have consistently documented the preservation of accurate information about geography, ecology, history, and social relationships over periods that extend to hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. The Australian Aboriginal songlines, geographical memory systems encoded in song that allow navigators to travel across vast distances of unfamiliar terrain by following routes embedded in musical narrative, are perhaps the most famous example. But similar systems of knowledge encoded in story and song have been documented across indigenous traditions on every inhabited continent. For early humans, the oral tradition was the mechanism through which the knowledge of the dead was preserved and transmitted. When an elder died who knew where the water was in the dry season, that knowledge did not die with her if her stories had been heard and remembered by the people around her. The story of the journey to the hidden water source, told often enough and vividly enough, encoded not just the fact of the water's existence, but the specific landmarks that mark the route, the seasonal conditions under which it was reliable, the precautions necessary to approach it safely. The story was about survival, and telling the story was an act of love toward the dead person, a way of honoring them, of extending their influence beyond their biological death, of ensuring that what they knew would continue to protect the people they had cared for. The evidence for grief-like behaviour in non-human animals has grown substantially in the last 2 decades, as ethologists and animal behaviourists have brought more rigorous methodology to the study of what animals do when they lose members of their social group. The results have consistently challenged earlier assumptions about the uniqueness of human grief and have suggested instead that grief, in some form, is a feature of the social lives of multiple species with complex attachment systems. Dolphins have been observed supporting the bodies of dead companions and calves at the surface for extended periods, behaviour that has no survival utility and that appears to reflect a reluctance to abandon the dead animal. In some documented cases, the behaviour has continued for days. Whether this represents grief in the phenomenological sense, whether the dolphin experiences subjective suffering at the loss, is impossible to determine from behavioural evidence alone. But the behaviour is consistent with an intense disruption of the attachment system, and its similarity to behaviours documented in human grief is striking. Ravens, which are among the most cognitively sophisticated of the corvids, have been observed engaging in what researchers have called funeral-like gatherings when a group member dies. Large numbers of ravens will assemble around the body of a dead raven, sometimes remaining near it for extended periods in apparent silence. The function of this behaviour is not fully understood, but it does not appear to be predatory or territorial. Some researchers have suggested that it may serve an information-gathering function, that the assembled ravens are assessing the cause of death and updating their threat models accordingly. But the behaviour has a quality that is difficult to explain purely in terms of information processing, and the comparison to human funeral gatherings has been made by multiple researchers in terms that go beyond simple metaphor. The continuity between prehistoric grief and modern grief is not simply a philosophical observation. It is a biological fact with practical implications. The grief that modern human beings experience, with all its intensity, its duration, its disruption of ordinary functioning, its resistance to rational management, is the same grief that early humans experienced, expressed through the same neural systems, driven by the same evolved attachment mechanisms. Modern grief therapy and support systems are, in a sense, the latest iteration of what hunter-gatherer communities have always done, providing presence, support, story, and the shared acknowledgement of loss that makes individual grief bearable. The pathologization of grief in modern culture, the tendency to treat prolonged mourning as a disorder requiring medical intervention, the discomfort with grief that does not resolve itself on a convenient schedule, the implicit cultural message that grief should be private and brief and then finished, represents a departure from the human norm rather than an expression of it. For most of human history, grief was a communal affair. It was expressed publicly, supported communally, and allowed to run its natural course without pressure to conclude on a predetermined timeline. The medicalization of grief is a recent development, and the evidence from both evolutionary biology and anthropology suggests that it may not be entirely well adapted to the actual needs of grieving human beings. What the fossil record tells us ultimately is that grief is not a problem to be solved. It is not a malfunction, not a disorder, not an irrational response to a rational event. It is the expression of one of the most fundamental features of human nature, the capacity for deep, sustained, emotionally costly attachment to specific other individuals. That capacity is what makes human social life possible. It is what holds communities together, what motivates the care of the young and the old and the sick and the injured, what drives the transmission of knowledge across generations, what makes it possible for small groups of vulnerable animals to survive in environments that would otherwise overwhelm them. Grief is the shadow of all of that. It is what love looks like when its object is gone. The people who buried their dead with ochre and antlers and mammoth ivory beads were not performing empty rituals. They were doing what human beings have always done in the face of the worst thing that happens to us. They were refusing to accept that love ends with death. They were insisting, through the only language available to them, that the person who was gone had mattered, had been real, had been loved, and would be remembered. That insistence is 100,000 years old. It is as new as the last funeral that has been held anywhere on Earth. It is, in the deepest sense, what makes us human, and it is the thing that connects every person who has ever lived to every other person who has ever lived, across every language and every culture and every millennium of human history. We all grieve. We have always grieved. And in the grief, if we are paying attention, we can find each other. The role of smell and touch in prehistoric grief is something that the archaeological record cannot document, but that the biology and the ethnography make almost certain. Grief in human beings is a profoundly embodied experience. It manifests in the body as well as in the mind, in the chest and the throat and the stomach, in the physical ache of absence that the bereaved describe across cultures and across centuries with a consistency that speaks to a shared biological experience. For early humans, who lived in far greater physical proximity to each other than most modern people do, the embodied dimension of grief would have been acute. The body of the person who was gone had been a constant physical presence. Its warmth in sleep, its smell, the specific quality of its touch. The loss of that presence was not just an emotional event, but a physical one, registered in the body as a genuine sensation of loss. Modern neuroscience has illuminated the biology of this physical experience of grief in ways that would not have surprised our prehistoric ancestors, though they had no language for it. The opioid system, the same neural system that mediates the experience of physical pain, is also involved in the processing of social loss. Research by Naomi Eisenberger and others has shown that social rejection and loss activate the same brain regions as physical pain, and that the experience of grief is neurologically similar to the experience of being hurt. This is not metaphorical. It is literal. The pain of loss is real pain, processed by the same systems that process the pain of injury. For early humans who had no framework for distinguishing emotional pain from physical pain, who may not have had separate concepts for these two kinds of suffering, the experience of grief would have been exactly what it felt like, something that hurt. The management of physical pain in early human communities was a domain of considerable practical knowledge. Medicinal plants with analgesic properties, plants containing salicylates, opioids, or other pain-modifying compounds, were known and used by early humans, as the evidence from dental calculus and from botanical remains at archaeological sites suggests. Whether any of this pharmacological knowledge was applied specifically to the management of grief, whether early humans used any plant medicines in the context of death ritual or bereavement, we cannot know with certainty. But given the sophistication of early human botanical knowledge and the recognized overlap between physical and emotional suffering, it would not be surprising if some of the same remedies were applied to both. The physical dimension of grief also manifests in behavior, in the rocking, the keening, the self-touching that bereaved people across cultures engage in spontaneously, and that appear to be automatic, instinctive responses to loss rather than culturally learned behaviors. These behaviors activate the self-soothing systems of the nervous system, providing a degree of comfort through physical sensation that partially compensates for the comfort that was previously provided by the presence of the lost attachment figure. They are behaviors that appear in infants separated from their caregivers, in adult humans experiencing bereavement, and in non-human primates who have lost companions. They are among the oldest and most basic responses in the mammalian attachment system. And they are behaviors that early humans almost certainly engaged in the immediate aftermath of loss, just as human beings engage in them today. The passage of time in grief follows a pattern that has been documented across cultures and across history. and that the archaeological evidence allows us to glimpse in fragmentary form. The acute phase of grief, the period of most intense distress, social disruption, and practical dysfunction, is followed by a longer period of integration in which the loss is incorporated into the ongoing life of the bereaved person and the community without being forgotten or minimized. Modern grief research has largely abandoned the stage models of grief, the idea that grief proceeds through fixed, predictable stages, in favor of more dynamic models that acknowledge the variability and non-linearity of the experience. What the research consistently shows is that grief does not end. It changes. The intensity of the acute phase subsides, but the relationship with the dead person continues. The person is not forgotten. They become part of a different kind of presence in the life of the bereaved, a presence that is no longer physical, no longer capable of responding, but that continues to shape how the bereaved person thinks and feels and acts in the world. For early humans, this ongoing relationship with the dead would have been expressed primarily through memory and through story. The dead person continued to exist in the stories told about them, in the specific narratives that preserved their particular way of doing things, their particular knowledge, their particular character. The hunter who had an uncanny ability to read the wind, the gatherer who knew the specific valley where the berries ripened earliest, the elder who remembered the flood that had happened 40 years before and whose memory of it had guided the community to safety on a high ledge above the river. These people lived on in their stories, and the stories were told not only in the immediate aftermath of death but for years afterward, as long as anyone who had known them was alive to tell them. The moment when the last person who knew the dead person dies, when there's no one left who has a direct memory of them, represents a second death in the oral tradition, a moment of true disappearance from the human record. For modern people with access to writing and photography and recording technologies, this second death can be indefinitely deferred. The words and images and recordings of the dead persist for as long as the media on which they are stored persists. For early humans with only oral tradition as their memory technology, the second death came within 1 or 2 generations, within the lifetimes of the grandchildren of the dead person, at most. This finite horizon on memory would have given a particular urgency to the act of storytelling. Every time you told a story about the dead, you were extending their existence. Every time the story was not told, they slipped a little further toward the second death. The storyteller was not just an entertainer, they were a keeper of the dead. The relationship between grief and creativity is one that has been explored extensively in modern psychology and that appears with striking frequency in the archaeological record. The art of the Upper Paleolithic, the cave paintings, the carved figurines, the engraved bones, was created in a context in which death and loss were constant presences. Some researchers have proposed that specific works of Paleolithic art are connected to death rituals, that the caves themselves were used for ceremonial purposes connected to the management of grief and the commemoration of the dead. Whether or not this is true of any specific work, the general connection between death and artistic creation appears to be deep and consistent in human culture. Art is one of the ways that human beings make meaning out of loss. It is one of the ways that the emotional energy of grief is transformed into something that persists, something that can be seen and heard and shared by others, something that keeps the dead present in a form that goes beyond the capacity of memory alone. The Venus figurines of the Upper Paleolithic, small carved female figures found at sites across Europe and dating to between 35,000 and 11,000 years ago, have been interpreted in many ways. Fertility symbols, goddess figures, self-portraits, hunting magic, children's toys. The debate about their meaning is extensive and unresolved. But one interpretation that has received relatively little attention is the commemorative one. The possibility that at least some of these figures represent specific dead women, carved to keep them present in the community after their death. This interpretation is consistent with the context in which some of the figures have been found, buried with individuals, found in grave contexts, or found in locations associated with death rituals. It is also consistent with a universal feature of human grief, the desire to create an image of the lost person, to have something physical to look at and hold when the person themselves can no longer be looked at or held. The treatment of the body in the immediate aftermath of death varies considerably across cultures and across the archaeological record, but several patterns appear with sufficient consistency to suggest that they reflect deep features of human psychology. The cleaning and preparation of the body, washing, arranging, sometimes dressing or painting, appears across multiple archaeological contexts and across the ethnographic literature. This preparation is not simply hygienic, it is one of the last acts of care that the living can perform for the dead, and it serves an important function in the grief process. It gives the bereaved something to do in the moments when doing nothing is unbearable. It is an act of love in its literal form, tending to the physical needs of a person who can no longer tend to themselves. The decision of where to bury the dead, in what location, in what orientation, in proximity to what features of the landscape, was not made carelessly in early human communities. The archaeological evidence consistently shows deliberateness in the choice of burial location. Bodies are placed in specific positions relative to the local topography, the prevailing winds, the direction of sunrise and sunset. Some burials appear to be oriented towards specific astronomical features. Whether these orientations reflect cosmological beliefs, practical considerations, or simply the aesthetic sense of the people performing the burial is something that varies by context, and that cannot always be determined from the archaeological evidence alone. But the consistency of deliberate orientation across multiple sites suggests that where you buried the dead mattered. It was a decision made with attention and intention, reflecting beliefs about the relationship between the dead person and the landscape in which they were placed. The mourning period, the recognized social phase of grief following a death, is a feature of virtually every human culture, though its duration and its specific rules vary enormously. In some societies, mourning lasts days, in others, months or years. In some, specific behaviors are prescribed. The wearing of particular garments, the avoidance of certain foods, the abstention from specific activities. In others, the rules are less formalized, but the social recognition of the bereaved person's special status is no less real. For early humans, the mourning period would have been embedded in the social fabric of the band without formal codification. Everyone in the band would have known that the bereaved person needed support, would have known approximately what kind of support to offer, and would have made the adjustments necessary to provide it. The informality of this system did not make it less effective. In a community of 25 people, where everyone knew everyone else intimately, the needs of the bereaved were visible without being stated, and the response of the community was immediate and personal. The moment of returning to normal life, or rather to a new normal since the world after a significant loss is permanently different from the world before, is one that grief researchers describe as one of the most complex transitions in the grieving process. The bereaved person must simultaneously maintain their relationship with the dead and re-engage with the living. They must carry the loss and continue to function. The tension between these two demands is at the heart of what makes grief difficult, and it is a tension that appears in the ethnographic literature of hunter-gatherer bereavement with the same clarity that it appears in modern grief therapy. The community's role in supporting this transition is critical. The stories told about the dead, which keep them present, must eventually be balanced by a return to the practical and social rhythms of daily life. The community helps to achieve this balance by providing both, by telling the stories and also by insisting, gently but persistently, on the return to work and to relationship, and to the ongoing business of survival. The way that early human communities understood the cause of death is a question that sits at the intersection of anthropology, cognitive science, and the history of religion. Modern people living in industrialized societies have access to medical explanations for death. We understand that people die of heart attacks, of infections, of cancers, of the accumulated damage of age. We have a framework, however imperfect, within which death makes sense as a biological event. Early humans did not have this framework. They had detailed knowledge of the practical consequences of certain kinds of injury and illness, and they certainly understood that being gored by an aurochs or falling from a cliff could be fatal. But the death of a relatively healthy person from what we would now call infection, or cardiac failure or stroke, would have been, in the absence of germ theory or medical knowledge, profoundly mysterious. The response to this mystery, the need to find an explanation for why this particular person died at this particular time, is one of the most powerful drivers of supernatural belief in human cognitive psychology. The psychologist Paul Bloom and the anthropologist Pascal Boyer have both argued that supernatural beliefs, including beliefs about the dead and about the causes of death, arise naturally from features of the human mind that evolved for other purposes. The tendency to attribute intentional causation to events, the tendency to see agency behind occurrences that might otherwise seem random, the difficulty of accepting that a person who was full of life yesterday can simply be gone today. All of these cognitive tendencies push the mind toward explanations that invoke invisible agents, spirits, ancestors, gods. The dead person has been taken by something. The death was caused by someone. The world is structured in ways that can be understood and perhaps influenced. Whether early humans had anything recognizable as a theology of death, a structured set of beliefs about what happens after death, about where the dead go, about the relationship between the living and the dead, is something we cannot determine from the archaeological evidence alone. What we can say is that the behavior visible in the archaeological record is consistent with a belief that death is not simply an ending. The grave goods, the ochre, the careful arrangement of the body, the apparent orientation toward cosmological features, all of these are consistent with a belief that the dead person continues in some form, that they can use tools and wear ornaments, that their location in the landscape matters, that the transition from life to death requires ritual preparation. Whether these beliefs were articulated as a coherent theology or were simply intuitions expressed in action without formal systematic elaboration, we cannot know. The cognitive science of death anxiety, the awareness of one's own mortality, and the psychological responses to that awareness, is a field that has grown substantially since the development of terror management theory by Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pisczynski in the 1980s. Terror management theory proposes that much of human cultural behavior is motivated, at least in part, by the management of the existential anxiety that arises from the awareness of one's own inevitable death. Humans are unique among animals in being aware of their own mortality, and this awareness creates a specific kind of psychological challenge that cultural systems, religion, art, legacy, the pursuit of symbolic immortality through fame or through children, have evolved to address. Whether early humans had this kind of existential awareness of their own mortality is a question that the archaeological evidence cannot directly answer. But the evidence from the burials, particularly the elaborate preparation of graves and grave goods, suggest that the people who performed these burials were thinking not just about the person who had died, but about what death means, about what lies beyond it, about the relationship between the living and the dead. This is the thinking of people who are aware of their own mortality and who are working out what to do with that awareness. The transmission of death-related knowledge from generation to generation in early human communities would have begun early. Children in hunter-gatherer societies are present for death in ways that children in modern, industrialized societies typically are not. In a band of 25 people, there is nowhere to send the children when someone is dying. There is no hospital to which the dying can be removed, no funeral home to which the body can be taken for professional preparation. Death happens in the camp, visible to everyone, including the children. And the response to death, the rituals, the mourning, the burial, also happens in the presence of the children. This early exposure to death and to the community's response to death was not traumatic in the way that unexpected exposure to death might be for a modern child who has been sheltered from it. It was the normal course of life. Children learned what death looked like and what the community did in response to it, and this learning was part of their preparation for the adult world. The archaeology of childhood grief, evidence for children's responses to the death of parents or siblings, is among the most moving material in the prehistoric record. There are cases of burials that appear to include a parent and child interred together, suggesting either that they died at the same time or that the community chose to reunite them in death. There are cases of burials of children that show evidence of having been reopened, of the grave being disturbed sometime after the initial burial and then closed again. Whether these reopenings represent later burials of related individuals, ritual activities connected to the commemoration of the dead, or something else entirely, we cannot always determine. But the reopening of graves, the return to the place of burial, suggest an ongoing relationship with the dead that did not end when the earth was replaced over the body. The role of music in the communal processing of grief is documented so consistently across cultures and across history that its absence in prehistoric communities would require explanation. Music has specific physiological effects that make it particularly suited to the management of intense emotion. It modulates arousal, synchronizes physiological responses across individuals, promotes the release of opioids and oxytocin, and creates a shared emotional experience that connects the people who are listening to or creating it. In grief specifically, music provides a container for emotion that is simultaneously individual and communal. It allows each person to feel their own grief while sharing it with everyone else present. The bone flutes found at Upper Paleolithic sites are not simply curiosities. They are evidence of a musical culture that was sophisticated enough to produce instruments capable of playing melodies, and that therefore almost certainly used music in the full range of social contexts, including the most important ones, including death. The natural world provided early humans with a continuous and unavoidable education in death and loss. Every hunt that succeeded produced a death. Every season brought the death of plants and the dormancy of others. The landscape itself was marked by the evidence of past death, the bones of animals, the dead wood of fallen trees, the places where fires had burned and left the ground blackened and bare. Early humans were not sheltered from death by the structures of modern civilization. They encountered it constantly, in forms both small and large, and their understanding of it was grounded in direct observation, rather than in the mediated accounts that most modern people receive. This does not mean that early humans were callous about death, or that familiarity made loss easier to bear. The evidence from the burials and from the care of the sick and dying suggests precisely the opposite. That early humans took death very seriously, that it demanded ritual response, that it was not something to be managed with efficient dispatch and quickly forgotten. But it does mean that early humans had a direct and unmediated relationship with mortality that shaped their understanding of it in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. The stars were one of the few constant features of the early human world that offered a perspective on mortality different from anything that daily life could provide. The sky visible from any location in the prehistoric world, undimmed by artificial light, unobscured by smog, seen by eyes adapted to darkness in a way that modern eyes rarely are, was a spectacle of a kind that most modern people have never experienced. The Milky Way was visible in its full breadth, the planets moving against the fixed background of the stars, the constellations wheeling through the year in their ancient patterns. This was the most permanent and the most extensive thing that early humans could see. Against the brevity and the uncertainty of individual human life, the stars offered something that felt permanent. Whether this feeling developed into anything like a cosmology, whether early humans had stories about the stars that connected them to the dead and to the afterlife, we cannot know with certainty. But the consistent astronomical orientation of many prehistoric burial sites, the alignment of graves with the direction of sunrise, the placement of burials within view of specific constellations, suggests that the sky was part of the framework within which early humans understood death. There is a quality to the evidence for prehistoric grief that becomes apparent only when you have spent time with it, when you have read the descriptions of the burials, looked at the photographs of the grave goods, followed the arguments about what the arrangements of bones mean and what the presence of specific objects implies. That quality is tenderness. The word sounds sentimental, and perhaps it is, but it is the word that the evidence calls for. The care was taken with the body at Qafzeh, the thousands of beads sewn onto the children's clothing at Sungir, the objects placed in the hands of the dead, the ochre applied to bones that would never again warm in sunlight. These are not the acts of people performing a mechanical social obligation. They are the acts of people who cared deeply and specifically about the person they were burying. They are acts of love directed towards someone who could no longer receive it, but toward whom love continued to flow anyway. Because love does not stop simply because its object is gone. That is what grief is. That is what these burials show us. And that is what connects every person who has ever lived in a state of love and loss to the people who placed deer antlers in a child's hands 100,000 years ago in a cave in what is now Palestine, among the San people of the Kalahari, one of the most extensively studied surviving hunter-gatherer communities. Grief following the death of a community member follows a pattern that anthropologists have documented with considerable precision. The immediate response is public and collective. Work stops. The band gathers. Food that has been prepared is shared among all members of the community as a specific act of communal solidarity. Eating together in the immediate aftermath of death is a marker of belonging, a physical assertion that the community continues even as one of its members is gone. The body is prepared carefully, washed and positioned, and burial typically takes place within the day of death. The grave is marked, often with a stone or with the personal belongings of the deceased, and then the name of the dead person is retired, not spoken aloud for an extended period, because the name is understood to carry the person's essence, and speaking it risks calling them back, which is understood to be dangerous for the living. The retirement of the name of the dead, the taboo on speaking the name of someone who has recently died, is a cultural practice found across an extraordinary range of traditional societies on every inhabited continent. It appears among Australian Aboriginal peoples, among numerous African hunter-gatherer and pastoralist communities, among indigenous peoples of North and South America, among traditional cultures across Asia and the Pacific. The specific duration of the name taboo varies from weeks to years, and the specific beliefs that underlie it vary from culture to culture. But the practice itself is so widespread that it appears to reflect something deep in human psychology, a recognition that the name of the dead person is powerful, that it carries emotional charge that can be overwhelming if invoked unexpectedly, and that a period of formal protection from that charge may be necessary for the bereaved to function. The opposite practice to the explicit, deliberate, frequent invocation of the name of the dead is also documented across human cultures, and it serves a different function. Among many traditions, the name of the dead is spoken constantly, in prayer, in story, in daily reference as a way of maintaining the presence of the dead person in the community's life. These two practices, the taboo on the name and the constant invocation of the name, reflect two different strategies for managing the same problem: the problem of how to maintain a relationship with someone who is no longer there to participate in the relationship. The taboo protects the bereaved from the overwhelming force of grief in the acute phase. The invocation keeps the dead person present in the longer term. Both strategies recognize that the relationship with the dead does not simply end at death, but must be actively managed by the living. The physical landscape of grief in a hunter-gatherer community is not confined to the grave. The places where the dead person lived and worked and walked become charged with their absence in a way that can be almost physically tangible. The spot by the fire where they always sat, the trail through the forest that they knew better than anyone, the particular tree under which they liked to rest at midday. These places retain their connection to the dead person long after the burial, and the bereaved person's encounter with them, the unavoidable daily return to the places that were shared, is one of the most characteristic features of grief in any cultural context. Among some hunter-gatherer communities, these places are deliberately avoided for a period after a death, as part of the management of grief in its acute phase. Among others, they are visited deliberately as places of connection with the dead. The specific practice varies, the underlying psychology does not. The relationship between grief and the broader natural world in hunter-gatherer cosmology is something that the ethnographic literature documents with particular richness. In many traditional societies, the death of a community member is understood to have implications that extend beyond the human community, that affect the relationship between the living and the landscape they inhabit, between the human community and the animal and plant communities with which it is interdependent. The death of an important elder might be understood to affect the hunting in a specific area, the fruiting of a specific grove of trees, the behavior of a particular herd of animals. Whether these beliefs reflect actual ecological observation, and sometimes they may, since the behavioral ecology of animals is genuinely affected by human activity in ways that observant hunter-gatherers would notice, or whether they are projections of human social dynamics onto the natural world, they reflect a conception of human death as an event with ramifications that extend far beyond the individual and the immediate community. The grief of early humans for the landscapes they loved, for the particular valleys and rivers and hillsides that were their homes in the most intimate possible sense, is not something that the archaeological record documents directly, but it is something that the ethnographic record illuminates. Among many hunter-gatherer communities, the loss of access to a particular landscape, through ecological change, through the encroachment of other groups, through seasonal conditions that make a usual territory uninhabitable, is experienced as a form of grief. The land is not simply a resource to be exploited. It is a home, a relationship, a presence that is known and loved with the same specificity and the same depth that people are known and loved. The prehistoric world was full of attachments that could be lost, not just to people but to places and seasons and ways of life, and the capacity for grief extended to all of these losses, not just to the deaths of individuals. The evidence from isotopic analysis of prehistoric human remains has added a new dimension to our understanding of early human mobility and, by extension, to our understanding of early human grief. Isotopic ratios in bones and teeth record the chemical signature of the water and food consumed during different periods of an individual's life, allowing researchers to determine where a person grew up versus where they died. Studies using these techniques have revealed that many prehistoric individuals died far from where they were born, that their lives involved substantial movement across landscapes, sometimes over hundreds of kilometers. This mobility has implications for grief. People who move far from their places of origin may leave behind not just family members, but an entire landscape of attachment. the specific places that were home in the deeper sense. And people who die far from where they were born may be mourned not only by those present at their death, but by those left behind in the landscapes they came from, who will never know precisely what happened to them. The question of what happened to people who died alone, who were separated from their band by accident or illness or conflict and died without community, is one that the fossil record occasionally illuminates in ways that are particularly poignant. There are skeletal remains of individuals who appear to have died in circumstances suggesting isolation, in remote locations, in positions inconsistent with burial, without the grave goods or the positioning that would indicate communal ritual. These individuals were not given the death that their communities would have wished for them. They did not receive the care and the ritual and the burial that the evidence suggests was important to early human communities. They died alone, in the worst possible circumstances, and while we cannot know whether anyone ever returned to look for them, whether anyone ever mourned specifically for this individual who failed to come home, the possibility carries a specific emotional weight that is difficult to shake off. In a community of 25 people, where everyone was known and where absence was immediately noticed, the failure of someone to return from a journey was not a statistical abstraction. It was the loss of a specific person whose specific absence was felt immediately and completely. The resilience of early human communities in the face of repeated loss is perhaps the most remarkable and the least remarked upon feature of the prehistoric record. In a world with no medicine, no food security, no protection from the weather beyond what animal skins and rock overhangs could provide, the death rate was high enough that every adult in every band had experienced multiple significant losses by middle age. The capacity to absorb these losses and continue, to grieve and then return to the work of survival, to mourn and then go out the next morning to hunt and gather, to bury the dead and then keep living, was not a sign of emotional shallowness or of an inability to feel. It was a form of strength, not the strength of suppression, not the strength of pretending that the loss had not happened, but the strength of integration, the capacity to carry the dead alongside the living, to hold both the grief and the necessity of continuing, and to go on. This is, in the end, what the prehistoric record of grief teaches us. Not that early humans were tougher than we are, or that they felt less than we do, but that the human capacity for grief is inseparable from the human capacity for resilience. We grieve because we love. We recover, partially, imperfectly, never completely, because we must, because living requires our presence, because the work of survival continues regardless of the losses we have sustained, because love, which is what grief is made of, is not exhausted by loss, but continues to flow, sometimes toward the dead through memory and ritual and story, and sometimes toward the living through the renewed commitment to the community that remains. The early humans who buried their dead with care, who tended their sick and their injured, who kept the names and the stories of the dead alive in the ongoing conversation of the band, they were doing exactly this. They were doing what human beings have always done. They were loving the living and honoring the dead, and finding a way to carry both forward into whatever came next.